Hi, this is Jorge, and I am presenting our work titled Crowdsourcing Syntactically Diverse Paraphrases with Diverse Word Prompts Workflows. So, task-oriented bots enable humans to perform tasks in natural language. For example, to search for restaurants and book the more suitable result. Here, paraphrasing is a critical task for reformulating a user utterance into other valid variations. Application of this task includes generating training or testing data to train and evaluate intent detection and slot filling models, but paraphrasing applies to other NLP tasks, such as question answering and machine translation. In this context, the diversity of the dataset is important, as it dictates the ability to capture the many ways users may express an intent. Paraphrasing techniques generally rely on approaches that aim at introducing lexical and syntactic variations. Lexical variation refer to changes that affect individual words, while syntactic variation instead refer to changes in sentence or phrasal structure. While the development of techniques to introduce such variation is the focus of ongoing work in automatic paraphrasing, they are currently greatly underexplored in the crowdsourcing community. A prominent approach to build datasets for training bots involves acquiring an initial set of seed utterances and then grow this set via crowdsourcing. Among the few contributions towards diversity, a prominent data collection framework involves turning a crowd-based paraphrasing into an iterative multi-stage pipeline. Here, multiple rounds of paraphrasing are chained together. An initial set of seed utterances are uploaded into a crowdsourcing platform, and workers provide paraphrases for this. A second crowd then validates these paraphrases, and finally, a seed selection step determines the seed for the next round. The focus of the strategies following this pipeline is to ultimately reduce the bias effect of factors like the seed utterances. The prompts leveraged in the paraphrase generation step are another element of the pipeline. Here, a baseline prompt may simply ask the crowd to provide paraphrases for a seed, or it can even include word suggestions for workers to use. While valuable, this contribution focuses primarily on lexical diversity, and it isn't clear to what extent current approaches are able to deliver on syntactic diversity. Our work introduces a multi-stage paraphrasing pipeline designed to guide the crowdsourcing process towards producing paraphrases that are syntactically diverse. We focus on paraphrase generation, and we assume an initial dataset of seeds and paraphrases. To capture and control for syntax, we rely on the notion of patterns. For a given utterance, we follow existing literature and use the top two levels of the syntax tree as the corresponding pattern. Going back to the pipeline, we introduce a pattern selection step that identifies the target patterns. These patterns are used to inform the paraphrase generation step, where we propose a set of prompts as shown in the picture. One prompt called patterns by example and the other called taboo patterns. If we consider as target patterns the unique patterns that are less frequent in the dataset we receive as input, the tail of the distribution shown in the chart, then we could simply sample a paraphrase from each pattern in this portion of the distribution and enhance the baseline prompt to show these paraphrases. This is what the patterns by example prompt does. It encourages the crowd to contribute paraphrases for the less frequent patterns in the dataset. On the other hand, the taboo patterns instruct the crowd to avoid popular syntax. It does so by showing example paraphrases for the most frequent patterns. Overall, the prompts aim to steer the crowd towards a specific syntax or encourage workers to contribute paraphrases with novel syntax. Now, let's turn into our experiment. The goal is to evaluate whether our approach can effectively steer the crowd towards more syntactically diverse paraphrases and to assess performance of the tail or of state-of-the-art pipelines in providing syntactically diverse paraphrases and compare how our approach fares in comparison. For this, we run an experiment on the Toloka crowdsourcing platform. We consider seed utterances representing a broad set of intents and domains drawn from 3 different relevant datasets. Our experimental conditions compares the 2 prompts we propose against 3 baselines representing multi-stage approaches to diversity from the literature. Finally, we analyze our results from different angles, such as the relevance of the paraphrases produced in each condition, how much syntactic control can our prompts introduce, the resulting syntactic diversity, and the effort incurred on workers. Since our approach assumes an initial dataset of paraphrases, we run one iteration of the standard pipeline using the baseline prompt. Workers paraphrase a dataset of 51 seeds we built using the dataset we mentioned previously. We obtain more than 1,000 paraphrases, 24 per seed. We perform manually the paraphrase validation step, and the outcome of the booster round serves as the input for the main experiment. As mentioned previously, the baseline conditions represent approaches found in the literature. The baseline condition defines the seed selection step to randomly pick one valid paraphrase per seed. The Chinese whisper baselines sets the seed selection strategy to randomly pick 8 valid paraphrases per seed, while the last baseline approach is the baseline outlier, where the seed selection step randomly pick one paraphrase per seed based on the notion of outlier. The last two experimental conditions represent our approach. As mentioned before, the pattern selection step identifies target patterns. The pattern by example condition picks the k less frequent patterns as the target patterns, and one example is randomly picked for each of the target patterns. And this is shown an example in the prompt. While for the taboo pattern condition, the pattern selection step picks the k most frequent patterns and defines example of this as taboo. Now let's see the results. We collected a total of more than 7,000 paraphrases from 877 workers, which we obtained between the bootstrap round and the main round of the experiment. Now, in our paper, we list out the criteria we use to judge whether a paraphrase is relevant or not to the input utterance. And here I'll primarily focus on summarizing our results. We see that the baseline outliers features the lowest number of relevant paraphrases among the baselines, which we attribute to having a semantic outlier as input seed. Albeit still relevant, the outlier might be pushing workers to contribute paraphrases that get semantically farther from the seed they saw in their task. In the literature, the Chinese whisper approach has also shown to produce less relevant paraphrases from the initial seed at each iteration. But in our experiment, having based the seed selection on valid paraphrases reduced this effect. Having the baseline rely on random sampling for seed selection strategy result in a higher percentage of relevant paraphrases. We see the patterns by example condition coming second to the performance of the baseline, hinting that the specific steering strategy did not affect negatively on the relevance. However, taboo patterns came last, suggesting that workers experienced difficulties contributed with paraphrases that avoided the taboo patterns. We analyzed the effectiveness of the proposed pipeline to steer the process towards syntactic variation by assessing the syntactic control introduced by the prompts and also the impact on diversity. We found that no paraphrases match the patterns presented as taboo in the taboo patterns condition. 19% of the paraphrases match the pattern shown in example in the patterns by example condition, and for references, 15% of the paraphrase match the pattern in the seed utterance for the baseline condition. Now, TED stands for tree edit distance, and we use it to measure syntactic similarity by comparing two full syntax trees after removing word tokens. It basically tells you the number of edits to go from one sentence to another in terms of syntax. Now, the number you see here represents the mean edit distance with respect to the example we show as taboo or as recommended. When compared to the baseline, we see a higher distance, with the highest score for the taboo patterns condition. This ultimately indicates that the ability of these prompts to guide the syntactic variations. Overall, we observe a high number of unique patterns in the syntax of our condition, with the number of novel patterns being 5 on average for both taboo and patterns by example. By novel, we mean not found in the bootstrap round. This suggests our approach was more effective than the baseline in eliciting novel syntactic variations. To measure syntactic diversity, we rely on the syntactic similarity metric we mentioned before, and apply it to all pairs of utterances sharing the same intent to compute the mean syntactic distance in the whole corpus. Considering the paraphrase for the main route only, we observe the syntactic aware condition featuring higher syntactic diversity than the baseline counterparts. And looking at the entire workflow, meaning the bootstrap plus main round, the general trend still favors our approach. These results ultimately highlight the benefits of introducing the notion of patterns into the workflow. For general diversity, we adopted diff, which computes the diversity at the corpus level by calculating engrams changes between all pairs of utterances sharing the same intent. We see the syntax-aware condition resulted in a higher mean diff score than the baseline. The baseline and the baseline outlier conditions features very similar score, while the Chinese whisper baseline show the lowest score. This means that when considered general diversity, lexical and syntactic, the proposed prompts still result in higher performance. And if we look at the workflow level, we see scores balancing out, suggesting that the focus on syntactic variation might produce less lexically diverse paraphrases. We consider the task completion time as a proxy for worker effort. Overall, the syntactic-aware prompts demanded a higher level of effort from workers. The time workers spent on the task was significantly higher in syntax-aware prompts, with median time around 320 seconds, while the baseline ranged between 240 and 280 seconds. Another related metric is the task abandonment, which overall ranged from 45% to 67%, meaning workers that open the task and then ultimately just drop. It topped at 47% for the baseline, but it was 57% for the pattern by example condition and 67% for the taboo condition. So, let me summarize these results. The proposed prompts were effective in guiding workers towards or away from a specific syntax, as indicated by the conformity of and syntax similarity metrics. This control ultimately yields a higher number of unique syntax patterns. Our results confirm the added benefits of such control, as our approach elicited paraphrases featuring more diverse syntax structures. We've seen that our syntactic-aware approach is able to elicit more uniform pattern distribution, while the baseline with no guidance led to paraphrases accumulated around certain patterns. And the proposed prompts were generally more challenging for workers. This tells us that improvement in syntactic diversity will come at the price of an increased task effort, ranging between 23 to 25% more effort and therefore more budget. Thanks.
Questions? Maybe while some of you are thinking, I could start. Jorge, do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you perfectly.
Oh, excellent. This was a clear presentation, pretty clear to what we have done in terms of patterns and experiment and how it works for crowdsourcing. My question is simple. Compared with Google search, what is that you offer and that Google search does not?
That's a very interesting question, and I was expecting it. Yeah, the reason. Oh, okay. This is not my laptop battery then. So this is not like an approach that doesn't place nicely with automatic approaches, like whatever machine learning models that powers Google search, for instance, or Siri. It is sort of as a technique to enhance a particular validation or training data set. When the model starts to fail at specific patterns of, in this case, utterances. This is why the whole focus of this work is to see if we can actually guide crowdsourcing workers towards producing contribution targeting a specific pattern or a specific syntax. Because then you can have your human in the loop data collection pipeline that can bump a particular tail of the distribution of utterance that you have in your dataset by just asking the crowdsourcing workers to produce contribution matching your desired criteria, in this case, a pattern.
Good answer in my view, and of course the question is such because many of us know Google search, but definitely good to make some progress beyond the known ones. And just one more question from my side. Have you been so far practicing only with English or even with other languages?
That's a very interesting question as well, because we did it in English just because of it is also a high. I mean, in terms of available dataset, there is a lot, but I have definitely not tried. Haven't tried any other language yet, but I expect that they need to be language agnostic, in the sense that if we, for instance, translate all the prompts and feed a different data set in Spanish or in whatever language, we expect that to still work in the sense that we will see contribution matching a particular subset of patterns. But it will be a nice experiment to do to confirm this hypothesis, right?
It is interesting how you said that you expect that it will be language agnostic. You know more than I. I wouldn't expect that answer. It is great if it's so. Any further questions?
And just as a side note to expand my and this, for instance, was in English, but the contribution was from non-native speaker because the crowdsourcing Toloka platform is mainly from Eastern European contributors. So we try to mitigate this non-native English speakers characteristic by focusing on some English tests that the crowdsourcing platform provides.
Thank you for this additional. And I was about to say to hope to see you next year physically.
Yeah.
Conducting your answers wherever your research will fit.
Yes.
And we close then your session.
Thank you so much. Hope to be there in person next year.